Hey guys, so today I decided to do something a little bit different and create a tier list. In this case, a tier list of all the fascinating pharaohs of Egypt's most famous dynasty of pharaohs, the 18th, which is basically King Tut's family. This was a pretty amazing dynasty, and I think this will be a neat way of going through each and every one of its pharaohs and seeing which of them really stood above the rest, you know? So we're going to be ranking them based on two primary criteria. First, how many monuments did they build? How grand were their monuments? Because that's one of the hallmarks of a pharaoh, right? And second, how much glory did they gain for Egypt on the battlefield? How many material goods did they get? Did they loot from their enemies and give to Egypt's gods and people? You know, I think those are pretty good criteria. The ones that are really set above the rest, the ones that are almost unique in how exceptionally good they are going to be in S tier to fit with, the Sigma image, right? And the rest are pretty straightforward, except Amarna trash, which we will get to. So first, let's start with the first pharaoh of the dynasty, Ahmose I. He came to the throne in a pretty interesting way. You see, his father and older brother were members, well, they're categorized as members of the 17th dynasty, but, there really is no dynastic break between the 17th and 18th dynasties. And these 17th dynasty pharaohs had been waging a brutal war against the Hyksos, a foreign people group that had occupied the Nile Delta for centuries. And in the course of these wars, Ahmose's probable father, Seqenenre was butchered. If you look at his mummy, it's grotesque. As I said, he was preceded by his older brother Thutmose, but he died after a pretty short reign, so Ahmose came to the throne as a pretty young boy. So his mother, Amenhotep, served as regent, and she did a pretty good job, and then Ahmose really came into his own and was the one to finally finish up the job started by his father in driving away the Hyksos and reunifying Egypt. He did this by capturing the Hyksos capital of Varis, now Tel El Dabah, in the eastern Nile Delta. He attacked it 3 times, but it was only on the 4th attempt that he finally captured it. And then he chased the Hyksos to a fortress called Sharuhen and besieged that for 3 years. And then after he had taken that, he went all the way north to, I think, Byblos in an effort to really root out the Hyksos, right? Because they had been terrorizing Egypt. Well, I guess not terrorizing, but they had occupied Egypt for centuries. It was a total disgrace. So just for that, we have got to make Ahmose, who's this guy here, Sigma tier. I know it's a bit cringe, but come on. He was pretty unique. He also built Egypt's last ever pyramid, funnily enough, because after him, pharaohs were buried in rock-cut tombs, mainly in the Valley of the Kings. Well, he wasn't actually buried in his pyramid. It's thought that he was buried in some unidentified rock tomb in western Thebes. Okay, let's move on to Ahmose's successor, Amenhotep I, who is this gentleman right here. He came to the throne at a pretty young age too, and like with Ahmose, his mother played a pretty prominent role in his reign too. His father, Ahmose, had started some campaigns in Nubia to sort of consolidate the border, and he continued those, but really didn't do that much special. He commissioned some building work in Karnak, which is, if you didn't know, the main temple for the 18th dynasty in Thebes. Beautiful, one of the largest, if not the largest, temples in the world, because so many different pharaohs, many from the 18th dynasty, added on to it over centuries, millennia actually. So Amenhotep I. he wasn't that good of he was a pretty good pharaoh. In fact, he was deified. Well, all pharaohs were deified, but he was special to the inhabitants of a village called Deir el-Medina in western Thebes, in the foothills of western Thebes. These were the guys who built the tombs in the Valley of the Kings, and it's thought that Amenhotep I started up this village because they prayed to him so vehemently, So clearly he must have done some good things, and the material gained from his Nubian campaigns did improve Egypt's whole economy, and funnily enough, the water clock is known to have been invented during his reign. So, not Sigma tier, not A tier, B or C tier. I think B tier is pretty good. This guy was a pretty good pharaoh, but he wasn't truly exceptional. Also, by the way, his father reigned for 25 years and he reigned for 20 years. So he did have a good amount of time on the throne. Now, next, Amenhotep I's successor wasn't actually his son. It was a middle-aged military man named Thutmose I. Amazing guy. This guy is definitely in Sigma tier, and I'll tell you why. So he came to the throne probably because he married the daughter of Ahmose, who was also named Ahmose, although it's unclear if she was actually his daughter or even if she was related to the Ahmosid line in any way. But it's thought that he sort of married into the royal family. The reason why he's exceptional is that even though he ruled for only like 6 to 13 years, it's not certain, he basically set the precedent for all his successors to come, and was the first really great warrior pharaoh of the dynasty. Not only that, he extensively remodeled and restored Karnak, and built prolifically at other sites across Egypt and Nubia. These kings didn't just build at Karnak, they built all over the place. And Thutmose I especially, compared to his predecessor, not his successors though. He built 2 pylons at Karnak, which are basically these huge sort of gateway things. If you search Egyptian pylon up, you'll see it. And a treasury building there, pretty important. But as I said before, his main importance comes from the fact that he campaigned extensively. He made these amazingly beneficial campaigns, military campaigns for Egypt, in Nubia and in Asia. He campaigned in the regions of the Third and Fourth Cataract, which is pretty far south of the Egyptian border. Not the current Egyptian border, but what was basically the border to Egypt proper then at Aswan. And he got pretty much as far as the Fourth Cataract, which is amazingly far south. And one inscription at Tombos, near the Third Cataract in Nubia, describes his campaigns in a very amazing way. Let's hear it. It says, "The Nubian bowmen fall by the sword and are thrown aside on their lands. Their stench floods their valleys. The pieces cut from them are too much for the birds." This guy was amazing. Like, I'm not vouching for war crimes, but from the Egyptian point of view, war crimes against foreigners was a pretty epic thing. I'm not saying it's good, but to the Egyptians, and we're basically doing this from the perspective of the ancient Egyptians, to them it was, they were pretty xenophobic, so it was all right with them. And also, the ruler of the kingdom of Kush was hung on the front of the king's boat as he sailed back to Egypt. And of course, he campaigned in Syria and was the first king to skirmish with vassals of the kingdom of Mitanni, which would basically become the arch rival of Egypt during the 18th dynasty. And he even hunted elephants in Syria at a place called Ni. If you did, it sort of amazed me when I was researching this that there were elephants in Syria, but there were. And he may have even crossed the Euphrates River. Can you believe that? A pharaoh crossing the Euphrates River. I mean, that is spectacular. He also built 2 pretty amazing obelisks. They're still pretty awesome. Okay, now we have his... Oh, well, forgot to rank him. Where's Thutmose? Thutmose the First. This is Thutmose the First. He's definitely in Sigma tier. Absolutely. Okay, so his son, his heir, was sort of a dud. I mean, he didn't have much time on the throne to really prove himself, so really we don't know how capable he was. But unfortunately, he couldn't do much during his very short reign, which was like 3 years. Or maybe 14, it's not really sure. But he didn't have much time on the throne, that's for sure. His elder half-sister, Hatshepsut, was his great royal wife. Hatshepsut was the daughter of Ahmose and Thutmose I, so she may have had a connection to the Ahmose line, while Thutmose II was born to Thutmose by a secondary wife called Amenhotep, so he may have not had that connection. But, he was pharaoh. He was the rightful pharaoh. He may have been of poor health based on his mummy. Oh, by the way, all of these guys' mummies were found in western Thebes in a cache tomb called DB 320 back in, I believe, 1881. You can see their mummies. So, Thutmose II, he did squash rebellion in Nubia, but, he did build some monuments at Karnak and other sites in Egypt and Nubia, but, didn't do much, unfortunately. His successor was his son by a harem girl / minor wife named Isis, and that would go on to become this guy, Thutmose III, who's definitely an S tier, and I'll tell you why. But Thutmose II, his father, is not A, not B. I think he's got to go in C, unfortunately. But, it wasn't a bad guy, Thutmose III was technically his father's successor, really didn't get to rule when he became pharaoh, oddly enough, because he was a pretty young kid at the time. And his regent happened to be his stepmother / aunt, Hatshepsut, who, she was a pretty ambitious person, so she actually became his co-king in his year 2, his regnal year 2, and from that point on, for 20 more years, she was pharaoh, right? And Thutmose III was pushed out of the limelight. So we're going to cover her now. No, that's Amenhotep II. This is Hatshepsut, amazing pharaoh. Not quite S, but here's how it's going to go. She was an amazing builder. She didn't really launch any foreign campaigns, so that's a big minus, but she did build an amazing amount, some superb monuments that are flocked to by tourists today, like Deir el-Bahri, most famously, her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri, which is in western Thebes. I know all of these are like in western Thebes, but that's where they were buried. That's where these pharaohs had their mortuary temples, And Deir el-Bahri is this completely unique 3-terraced structure that's just marvelous to behold. It was cut into the side of the cliff, even. And she did a lot of other stuff, too. She had an interesting foreign policy in that she was the first pharaoh, to send a trade expedition to a place called Punt in centuries. Punt was basically the furthest south the New Kingdom Egyptians ever got, right? Because it was in Somalia or Eritrea or Djibouti or somewhere. It was somewhere near the Horn of Africa. So pretty amazingly far south. And she boasts of this in her mortuary temple on its walls. And she also brought trees from it, which is the first instance of transplantation of plants known, and she brought them to decorate her mortuary temple. You can actually see where these trees were placed in antiquity. And I think even the husks of some of them survive. So she was pretty cool. So Hatshepsut, maybe not quite S tier. I mean, you've probably heard a lot of things about her because she was one of the only female pharaohs, and, I think personally she's a bit overrated. I mean, she did basically steal power from her child nephew, so not the greatest look. And the fact that she was a woman meant that fundamentally her being on the throne disrupted Ma'at, the ancient Egyptians' conception of order and balance and justice in the universe. And after her reign, after she died, Thutmose III would go on to remove all instances of her name and the like that he could find. Well, near the end of his reign, not right after she died. And I'll explain that because now we're going to Thutmose III. So let's just put her in A. Well, no, this is Thutmose III. Actually, their statuary looks really similar. And that's been noted by art historians. So Hatshepsut goes in A. Thutmose III, definitely S. And here's why. He was the greatest warrior pharaoh of all time. He was the Napoleon of Egypt. That's literally his nickname. Because he made so many strides in creating the Egyptian empire in the Levant and in Nubia. So he had a 54-year-long reign to do all this in, 20 years of which were taken up by Hatshepsut. But during that time, he was able to train. He was able to grind to become an amazing soldier. Very tactically brilliant, too. So he had 17 years of campaigns during his reign, and it led to Egypt being the dominant power in the Levant, which, as you know, if you know about the history of the Levant, is a very difficult thing to do. And of course, this led to extraordinary material gain for Egypt's gods in all the donations he gave to the temples and all the additions he made to the temples. And of course, to its men, to its people. He bettered the lives of his people through his conquest. Probably. And the reason why he erased Hatshepsut's memory is that he needed to make way for his son, Amenhotep II, because it was possible that Hatshepsut had left some loose ends, some possible threats to Amenhotep's legitimacy, so they had to do it. They had to get rid of this violation of Ma'at. Not to say that she wasn't a good ruler, but fundamentally, unfortunately, she violated the conception of Ma'at for the ancient Egyptians. So Thutmose III was as prolific a builder as his stepmother, and built countless temples and added so much to Karnak, like 2 pylons, the 6th and 7th, and completely restructured and redecorated its core with scenes depicting his campaigns in Asia. And speaking of his campaigns, let's discuss them. He immediately started his sole rule by campaigning in order to secure the valuable resources that came from the Levant, like tin and cedar and copper and resin, and he had to defeat a coalition of rebel chiefs, right? And they were based at a place called Megiddo, which is actually the root of the word Armageddon. And to get to Megiddo, he had to go through one of 3 mountain passes, and this is where he displays his tactical brilliance, by the way. This is still studied in military schools, what he's about to do here. So he had to go through one of 3 mountain passes, right? One of which was so narrow that his men would have to go through it single file, and Thutmose III chose to go through this narrow pass instead of the other 2 passes, which were much wider. And the reason why is that he knew the enemy were not going to defend this narrow passage, because they must have thought, oh, the Egyptians are never going to come through here, they're going to come through the other passes. Well, as Thutmose predicted, they were wrong, right? And he did this against the advice of his officers, so amazing leadership here. And by going through this narrow pass and surprising his enemy at the other side, who were not defending this pass, he was able to rout their army and push up to Megiddo. Unfortunately, he didn't take Megiddo right there and then because his army was too busy looting the enemy camp outside of Megiddo. But Nonetheless, he eventually, after I think an 8-month siege, he captured Megiddo too, and captured a huge, I think 350 cities in total for Egypt in the Levant. Amazing. Like, imagine the loot from this. And actually, he gathered so much exotica from this that he also carved them onto the walls of Karnak to show how much Asian exotica he got. I'm not talking about weave shit, like Levantine stuff he got. That this led to him being the first pharaoh to have chickens. He had chickens. I think this is the first recorded instance of chickens being in Egypt. Imagine that. He also married women from the region too, and lavished gold on them, as you can see from some of their tombs which have been found. And yeah, amazing pharaoh, gotta say. Okay, so Thutmose III, definitely an S tier. Now we have to get to what I'm going to say is the most Sigma pharaoh there ever was. The most amazingly Sigma pharaoh there ever was, Amenhotep II, Thutmose III's son. He was an extremely active man. You could not stop this man's grind. He could boast of his amazing horsemanship, his bow and arrow skills, and his ability to fire them accurately by carving himself being depicted on his mighty chariot with the reins tied around his waist as he was going at incredibly fast speeds, firing arrows into the center of a bronze ingot. Amazing guy. And he also claimed that he could row a 30-foot oar 6 times faster than the Egyptian Marines. So it might not be true, but regardless, he was an amazingly fit guy, you know? And he also claimed that he was entrusted by his father to train his horses just as a boy. And like his father, he campaigned extensively all over the place. But after 9 years of campaigning, he decided that, it was enough and Egypt was at peace. And he had a reign of nearly 30 years. During his reign, he actually started to make peace with Egypt's arch nemesis, the Mitanni, which Thutmose III had fought and whose vassals he had fought. But that doesn't mean that he did not commit pretty horrendous war crimes against his enemies. For example, in the second year of his reign, he boasted of having defeated 7 Levantine princes in single combat, and then hanging their bodies from his ship as he sailed down the Nile, sticking 6 of them on the walls of Thebes and the last one, onto the walls of Napata, a city in Nubia, in order to send a message to the rebellious Nubians to not mess with me, right? And in a rare insight into a pharaoh's mindset, he, in a letter to the viceroy of Nubia, which the viceroy of Nubia had carved onto his tomb, he speaks of how distrusting of Nubians he was and how he hated Nubians. And that the governor shouldn't have promoted certain Nubians to certain positions and all this. So, pretty. Look, I'm not saying this is good. I'm not saying xenophobia is good in the modern world. I'm saying to the ancient Egyptians, this was the mark of a real patriot, And he also never depicted any of his wives on his monuments. Only his mother, He forsook the bitches in favor of his mother. What a sweet guy. Yeah. But this is probably to avoid another Hatshepsut situation, His body was also the only one found in its original resting place, with the exception of King Tut, and his tomb was used as a royal cache, which contained the mummies of a bunch of other pharaohs from the 18th dynasty and other dynasties. Also, in addition, there was a growing interest in cultural refinement, as evidenced by ancient literature to the Egyptian standards, so really ancient literature, being revived and copied down. And so Amenhotep II, in today's world, I forgot to mention that he also burned alive some of his Levantine enemies in a pit one time. So he in the modern world, he would be tried as a war criminal, but in ancient Egypt, this guy was unrivaled, unprecedented, amazing person, amazing reign, even though in today's world he would be a war criminal. So definitely S tier for a pharaoh. So next, we're approaching we basically got into the middle of the dynasty, so now we're at the latter half of the dynasty, pretty much. This is around 1400 BC when Amenhotep II dies, and his son, Thutmose IV, this guy, gets to the throne. I really like this pharaoh for some odd reason, because a couple of years ago, I tried to create a little mini documentary on this guy, which I didn't end up completing, but I did complete 80 pages of notes on this one pharaoh who ruled for like 10 years around 1400 BC. And it's never going to be made, but, I had fun. He's a pretty cool guy. And I'll tell you why. He's not S tier, but I think he is A tier because he's pretty underrated, but he did some cool stuff. He followed his father in making his mother his symbolic great royal wife and forsaking his harem. Well, not really. He did have some monuments made for them and all that, but his mother was before the hose. He claimed to have come to the throne in a pretty unique way. In a stela he set up in between the paws of, guess what, the Great Sphinx. He said that as a prince, he was hunting around Giza, hunting lions and stuff, as princes do, and took a nap underneath the shadow of the Sphinx. He got tired, so, he passed out under the Sphinx. And in a dream, the Great Sphinx, who is actually the solar god Horamakhet, Horus in the horizon, came to him in the dream and said, "Clean all this sand off me, and I'll give you the kingship of Egypt. I'll make you pharaoh." And so Thutmose, of course, wanting to be pharaoh, did exactly that. And that's how he attempted to legitimize his rule. Well, of course he was legitimate pharaoh, but it's thought that maybe some of his brothers weren't too keen on that and tried, and there may have been a bit of a dispute at the beginning of his reign, and Thutmose came out on top. But anyways, his reign was pretty cool. As I said, he had a pretty short reign, but he did a lot in it. He successfully maintained the empire through comparatively light campaigning in Nubia and the Levant, built some surviving monuments, not, as impressive as his forebears, and all that, but he did create, like, the Hypostyle Hall of Amada, which I mentioned in my last video, a peristyle court at Karnak, and tons of other monuments scattered all across the Nile Valley. Also, his tomb, KV-43, was the first multicolored tomb in all the Valley of the Kings. Pretty interesting. It was found by Carter prior to Tut's tomb, and it contained pieces of his chariot and even pieces of his family's clothes. Like, he borrowed clothes from his father, Amenhotep II. It had his name on it. Not to say he was poor or anything. It was fancy clothes, okay? Rich people hand down clothes, right? Sometimes, when it's fancy enough. And art began to fundamentally shift during this king's reign, and became way more stylized than it had been previously. For example, if you look at sculpture from late in Thutmose IV's reign, you'll see that he has very sort of slanted, oblique eyes. He also made peace with the Mitanni, finally, by marrying the Mitanni king's daughter, which is pretty cool. And the deification of the king while he was alive pretty much started in Thutmose IV's reign, because he was depicted with shebu beads on, which is these shebu beads make up a little necklace around his neck in some depictions. And that was previously that had only been reserved for dead kings. But now, Thutmose IV was flaunting them. So now the king was a god on earth, is what he was saying, just by these little beads. Crazy. And he also erected the tallest ever obelisk, the Lateran obelisk, which is now in Rome. It had been quarried out by Thutmose III, but he didn't actually erect it. But Thutmose IV finally did, after Amenhotep II had sort of left it laying around for 30 years. Yeah, pretty cool. Pretty cool guy. This is Thutmose IV here, as I said. I think he did do a lot, but is he an A-lister? More of a B-lister, I gotta say. But pretty amazing pharaoh, I gotta say. Okay, now we're getting to a pretty interesting point in Egyptian history. I'll tell you why in a sec. So now we're at Amenhotep III's reign. And Amenhotep III has to be at least an A tier, because it's been said by a lot of Egyptologists that Amenhotep III's reign was the peak of all of pharaonic Egypt. And why? Because it was the most prosperous, the most stable, the most economically sound period in pharaonic Egypt's history. And it was almost always peaceful, you know? He reigned for 40 years, pretty much. And during all that time, there weren't any major campaigns. There was no need. You know, Egypt had enough, right? It didn't have many rebellious vassals, and Amenhotep III could focus on his astounding building projects. He was a pharaoh. He didn't do business, he did building. Well, he did business in the running of the state, but he also did building, okay? His mortuary temple was one of the largest temples ever constructed anywhere in the world. But it was destroyed shortly after his death and was used as a quarry for other temples. And the only real major testaments to it, well, there are a bunch of sculptures testifying to it at the site, but the major testaments to it in the modern day and in antiquity, later antiquity, were the 60-foot tall colossi of Memnon, which were renowned in classical antiquity because they could whistle. They could whistle because the stones that made them up shifted in such a way that wind in the morning made a whistling sound that was renowned. Amenhotep III also built huge portions of Luxor Temple and a huge palace complex at Western Thebes, complete with a huge man-made lake that's over a mile long, which Amenhotep III and his beloved wife Tai sailed on. It's called Birket Habu, and the palace is called Malkata. So he was pretty cool, and he also built temples, of course, all over the place, because that's what you had to do as a pharaoh. You had to build temples every which where. And another interesting thing about this guy is he distributed scarabs bearing announcements of his various achievements all over the Near East. Plenty of them have been found beyond the borders of Egypt proper, which is pretty amazing. They include announcements from his marriage to Tai, to him bragging about single-handedly slaughtering hundreds of oxen and lions while hunting, and, you know, other stuff like marrying a Mitanni princess, and, of course, the creation of his massive pleasure lake, because why not? In addition, something that is sort of creepy is that he married two of his daughters. I don't think he had intimate relations with them. At least I hope he didn't. And I don't think I think it was like a symbolic thing, but he did marry two of his daughters. But something sinister was happening during the end of his reign. Art was changing dramatically. The king was hyper-stylized now in portraiture. And in addition, this god called the Aten was coming up in the Egyptian pantheon. The Aten was the embodiment of the sun disk, and this god would be at the forefront of a religious revolution in Amenhotep III's son's reign, which would devastate the country, pretty much. So, Amenhotep III himself, pretty amazing pharaoh, so he's definitely in A tier. And now we get to this, Amarna trash. Why is that there? Well, this guy, this guy, this guy, this guy, not this guy, not this guy, are gonna go in there because they were the pharaohs of the Amarna period, minus King Tut. And they led a period of not really destabilization, but a period that violated Ma'at 10 times more than what Hatshepsut did. So let's go to Akhenaten, the first of these guys. He ruled for probably just 16 years, but in that time, he did a lot of damage. He originally called himself Amenhotep IV, but he was obsessed with this new god. Well, sort of new god. He had been around in Thutmose IV's reign, but this god, Aten, the sun disk. And in fact, he started worshipping it exclusively. And in fact, tried to erase the memory of Egypt's chief god, Amun, the god that Karnak was dedicated to. And he erased Amun's name from his own temple. As a part of his religious revolution, as he ignored all the other gods except the Aten, which has been argued to be the first instance of monotheism, he moved the capital all the way to a virgin site in Middle Egypt now called Tel El Amarna, but he called it Akhenaten. And this happened in year 6. He moved the capital to bumfuck nowhere, Middle Egypt, in year 6. He built it using, I think, child labor, and portable bricks called talatat. Well, I mean, bricks are in essence portable, but portable large bricks called talatat, which could be somewhat easily carried. I mean, it still killed some children, and he used it to build his new temples and his new palaces and all that. Later pharaohs reused, after they condemned Akhenaten's memory, they used them to fill up their temples elsewhere in Egypt, because Amarna was abandoned. The most strange thing about this guy, Akhenaten, he showed himself with a huge chin, breasts, like female breasts, and a gut, like this big beer belly, sort of. This affected how everyone depicted themselves, at least everyone in the elite, and everyone was shown a bit more true to life than ever before. And to be fair, some amazingly realistic portraits were produced during this time, but otherwise, it's pretty uncanny, I think. And not only that, it threw out everything the Egyptians had done with art before. And this androgynous appearance may have been because he suffered from some pituitary gland condition, but no one really knows. And it's theorized that he moved the capital and erased Amun's names and closed his temples, by the way, because he wanted to restore power to the pharaoh after too much of it was taken away by the high priests of Amun, and to centralize Egyptian religion, so the royal family was the core of it, and they were the only intercessors between heaven and earth and all that. And that's possible. We don't really know exactly why. There's been a huge amount of debate about every aspect of the Amarna period. It's crazy. And for example, it used to be thought that he completely neglected Egypt's Levantine empire and left it to rot while his vassals cried for help and sent letters to him saying, hey, we need guys here. We need your guys to come and defeat your enemies that are attacking us. But he was too busy writing poetry in his new swanky capital. But recent findings have sort of disproven this. By poetry, I'm referring to how he personally wrote the hymn to the Aten, which is this interesting text praising the Aten, But, I don't think he was that good of a poet. No Shakespeare, for sure. And, of course, he had his famous wife, Nefertiti, who may or may not have been his maternal cousin. But he had other wives, including one that fathered King Tut, although it's possible Nefertiti was his mother. It's not known for sure. And it's possible that this person who had King Tut with Akhenaten was, in fact, one of his sisters, one of the daughters of Amenhotep III. And in a creepy way, like his father, he also did marry some of his daughters. I really hope that it wasn't like a real marriage, But you never know with this guy. Nefertiti played a far more prominent role, anyways, in her husband's reign than any other queen beforehand. She's even shown doing things only kings were shown doing before, like macing Egypt's enemies, not with a can of mace, but with an actual rock on a stick, you know. With Akhenaten's death, his religious revolution completely dissipated. Only the elite, only the court had really embraced it during his reign, and half-heartedly. And after his reign, everyone was like, screw this, we're going back to the normal stuff. And his capital was abandoned pretty soon after. And yep, huge failure. Terrible for Egypt. And yep, he is in Amarna trash tier, which is the equivalent of F tier. Now, we have Smen-Kakare, also known as Semen-Kakare. Just name him Kakare. He was a short-lived co-regent of Akhenaten that may have never had an actual sole reign. He only ruled for 2 years as Akhenaten's co-regent at the very end of Akhenaten's reign. And he was possibly a younger brother of his, or maybe even his son, making him an older brother of King Tut. But he also may have been Tut's father. Based on the mysterious skeleton found in the Valley of the King's tomb KV-55, which may be him, maybe Akhenaten, no one really knows. Huge amount of debate on that. And nothing for sure is really known about him. So he was too minor and too Amarna-y. He's an Amarna trash tier, for sure. Next, we have Nefer-Nefer-Uaten. So Nefer-Nefer-Uaten was probably Nefertiti, based on Nefer-Nefer-Uaten being one of her titles during Akhenaten's reign, and she probably seized power right after he died. She tried to start up the move back to tradition, so that's a plus. But she ruled extremely briefly, maybe only as an intermediary between Akhenaten and Tutankhamun, who was still like 9 years old when he came to the throne. And she was confused for Smen-Kakare for a long time because they share the same throne name, which is Smen-Kakare. And recently it was revealed she was a woman based on her epithets, right? So, yeah. Not really. So she did start moving back to orthodoxy, so that's pretty cool. But also she was one of the main perpetrators behind the Amarna heresy. So not C tier, F tier. Amarna trash tier. Down to the last 3 pharaohs of the dynasty, starting with everyone's favorite 18th dynasty pharaoh, Tutankhamun, who of course is known for his amazing tomb in the Valley of the Kings. One of the best time capsules we have from ancient Egypt. But his reign was also important for another reason, because he, or his administration, was the one who pulled Egypt back into normalcy. You know, they discarded the Amarna Revolution and they returned back to orthodoxy, reopening the temples, restoring some of the damage done, and even though Tutankhamun wasn't personally responsible for this, since not only was he an adolescent for most of his reign, he was also physically disabled, you know, he still oversaw this technically, you know, so he's not in Amarna trash by any means. I prematurely moved him to B. But yeah, you know what? I think B fits. Now, during his reign, his administration was mainly run by 2 prominent men. Horemheb, who was his commander-in-chief, and what else was he? He was also his designated heir, and this guy, who was his who may have been his grandfather or granduncle, probably more likely his granduncle, and Also, of course, maybe his granduncle and his grandfather, but definitely a high official, both in Akhenaten's reign and Tutankhamun's reign. And after Tutankhamun died, I would become his successor, even though that was probably meant for Horemheb, because he was the one who put Tutankhamun to rest while Horemheb was presumably fighting in the Levant. Because Ankhesenamun, who was Tutankhamun's sister and wife, died as a widow. And she sent word to the Hittite king that she wanted to marry one of his sons, because she didn't want to marry any of the peasants who were now in charge, right? So a prince from the Hittite Empire came. His name was Zenanza, but he didn't make it past the border because he was killed, probably by Horemheb, and Ankhesenamun probably had to marry I, who may have been her grandfather, keep in mind. But yeah, and so I was a pretty seedy dude. He also took Tutankhamun's original tomb, and buried him in a much smaller tomb than what had been originally intended. And he was also an old man when he came to the throne, so he only had like 3 years left in him. So he didn't really achieve much except his scheming, and he tried to install his son or adopted son as his designated heir, but that didn't work because after I passed away, Horemheb came to the fore, and he was pretty cool. We're definitely not putting him in Amarna trash. With the beginning of his reign, the Amarna period ends for sure. And he also was the guy who sort of execrated the names of all the Amarna pharaohs, and even Tutankhamun. Even though he had I's tomb destroyed, but not Tutankhamun's for some reason, which is probably because, there was some lingering connection, right? And yeah, he built extensively. He was very pro-Amun, He had no familial connection to the 18th dynasty at all. So really, he's not a part of it, but he's grouped in with them because after his reign, another family came to the throne, the 19th dynasty, and he was the one who chose them for the job because one of his former military colleagues, a guy named Paramesu, was chosen by him to be his designated heir, and that was probably mainly because he had an adult son, a capable soldier named Seti, who would go on to become the famous pharaoh Seti I, and Seti I had a young son named Ramses, who would eventually become Ramses II. So Horemheb was pretty cool. I think I'm going to put him at a solid, what should I put him at? A, B. Let's go with a B. He reigned for a long time, and he did achieve a lot, sort of. But, I think B is a good spot for him. And with that, our tier list is complete. Tell me what you think of my tier list down in the comments, and make sure to like and subscribe for more videos on ancient Egypt. Goodbye.